And we're live. Hello, everyone. Joshua Gilliland here, live from work because I had a lovely family dinner and came back to the office to record. Lower Decks continues to be a wonderful Star Trek experience. And we're going to get into last week's episode that was called Terminal Provocations, which takes being a buddy to a new level. And there are lots of nice deep cut references that are fun as well. So let's talk about this. And with me, as always, in the Lower Decks is Steve Chu and Nari Ely, government attorneys, and keeping the world safe for democracy. And we're going to rock and roll and nerd out about all the great stuff in last week's episode of Lower Decks. Steve, you have the con.
Thank you, Josh. So we are now at episode 6, and we are getting deeper into the season. Storylines are developing, and we're learning more about the characters and actively rooting for and maybe even against certain people. Episode 6, Terminal Provocations. So what we have here is the Cerritos confronts the Drukmani salvagers during a salvage operation. They find this old Starfleet vessel. We don't know exactly how old it is, but it's fairly old. That's sort of the first story we see, and then we also hear that's one of the main stories. And then we have another parallel story where we meet a crew member named Fletcher, who is introduced as a member of the Lower Decks group, and Fletcher pushes the boundaries in some interesting ways. And we'll talk about that. And then sort of a third story is that Rutherford and Tendi, we find out, has never had her zero gravity training in space. And so Rutherford says, well, no problem. Let's go do that on, of course, the holodeck. And they meet a new creation of Rutherford's named Badgie. And that leads to a very interesting adventure.
Nothing ever goes wrong on the holodeck. Safest technology in Star Trek.
Yes, unless the safety protocols are somehow deactivated, which happens in an alarming at an alarming rate. But oh well. So let's talk right off the bat about this wreckage. The Cerritos is trying to claim the Starfleet wreckage. The Drukmani wants to salvage all of it. They say that we found it. And there's an argument. Captain Freeman says, okay, well, you can get a finder's fee, but you don't get to keep everything. And the Drukmani will not back down. Josh, we're talking about some maritime type of issues, finders, keepers, things like that. What do you think here? Josh,
you're muted.
And semaphore to continue the maritime theme. But I do think lots of issues with this episode and the salvage. Specifically, that wrecked ship that we see floating around looks an awful lot like the drone cargo ships that were in the Star Trek animated series episode featuring the Tribbles. So like the different hull numbers, that it looks like the same class of ship, like it got hit by a mine. So they're not seeing 100-year-old corpses floating around in space. It was a drone ship. So, because that could have been a real bummer on a fun episode. If
For a comedy show, that would have been a little dark.
Yeah, all of a sudden they're having to bury people and like deal with remains of, not fun. That said, let's get into salvage, because there's a lot to talk about with salvage issues in maritime law. And let's talk about the legal definition of wrecked vessels. And this is 46 USCS section 12107. When it comes to wrecked vessels, we have this definition. A vessel is wrecked. I love legal terminology. A vessel is a wrecked vessel under this chapter if it was wrecked on the coast of the United States or adjacent waters, has undergone repairs in a shipyard in the United States equal to at least 3 times the appraised salvage value of the vessels, or appraisals. The Secretary may appoint 3 of the appraisers to determine whether a vessel satisfies Section A2, the one just above, the cost of the appraisal shall be paid by the owner. It's like, okay, that doesn't quite help us. But there's old case law from the 19th century that does, and specifically 1843 in a case called Wyman v. Holbert, which sounds very, very 19th century. And that says, but when the jury find the vessel and many were also abandoned by the owner, we suppose they intend to be understood that all hope, expectation, and intention to recover the property were utterly and entirely relinquished, and such the judges who tried the cause believe was the evidence given on trial. So is it derelict and abandoned? Well, this thing was beat up and it'd been floating there for a century. So they could go like, yeah, it's abandoned. But when we have a warship sink, it belongs to the native country it came from. So that's why no one salvaged the Bismarck, because after Bob Ballard found it, it's still the property of the German government. It's also why there's been evidence of some of the US ships that were lost in World War II suddenly aren't on the bottom anymore, meaning that scrappers went by and scrapped the remains of sunken warships and did God knows what to the remains of US servicemen. So that sort of thing tends to make people mad. So when you have a drone ship that's clearly Federation property, got the logo on it, got the badge, and it's floating around as junk, it's like, hey, it was our ship, still our ship. We didn't give up on it, and we didn't give up hope on that it could be found, and we never relinquished it. So from a military perspective, I think there's a good argument that that it is Starfleet property still. If it was a commercial ship, it'd be different.
Right. So this thing with being derelict or abandoned, that applies only to a privately owned ship, let's say.
Yes, not a warship. And if it's part of Starfleet, I think that part of maritime law would still control. This wasn't like the White Star Line or anything like that. So it's a very different situation.
And this is similar to some of the discussion we had on earlier episodes when we talked about, or maybe it was in one of our other podcasts, but about possible products liability suits for poor construction of a vessel. We were actually talking about a parallel universe, the Star Wars universe and the Millennium Falcon. In that instance, however, there were cases in which the court denied liability from people suing the manufacturers of the ship if it was a military ship. The requirement was that the ship had to be private and available for purchase by the public.
Right, and you disillusioned me, broke all my dreams that I could ever own an aircraft carrier.
Yeah, you're not the only one that has had that dream, Nari. But
there's some countries that fall into that category, kiddo. That's yeah. It's hard to do for a reason.
I mean, it's not the only obstacle to me getting an aircraft carrier, but it is.
So it's interesting. We constantly see courts draw this line between private vessels versus military or government vessels. So what do you think is the right outcome here, Josh? If these parties went to some sort of intergalactic, interstellar tribunal, and Drukmani said, "Look, we finders keepers," is their entire argument, and Starfleet would say, "Well, no. Under maritime law, you get a finder's fee, so you get some reward for finding it, but you don't get to keep what you found. You don't get all the Spanish doubloons that are inside the chest, so to speak, right?" What would happen? What do you think?
Well, on one level, this doesn't need a judicial resolution because other means were enacted to solve the problem. But I as soon as they fired or used the weaponized debris, it then became an issue of self-defense. So I did not have a problem if they had targeted the warp core to stop them from being fired upon. That said, I think this Galactic Admiralty Court would have said this is clearly Federation property. You get your finder's fee. End of discussion.
And is that because Starfleet is the military here, essentially?
Yeah, even though if they are more explorers, that's a very 17th century type view of the military. So yeah, I do agree with that.
Okay. Taking this, we can stay with this topic, even though we kind of spotted it for later. But the issue of refusing to fight, Captain Freeman refuses to fight, even though the Drukmani are firing upon them. And we get this sort of Starfleet ethical dilemma that, well, look, we're Starfleet, we're the good guys. We're not supposed to fight people when we're trying, arguing over a derelict vessel.
Can I add something here just briefly?
Sure.
I just wanted to note that I know this is later in your outline, so we can come back to it. But when it comes to the question of acting in self-defense by targeting the warp core, I do think there's actually a little bit of something there, where at least in Star Trek, historically, ships have targeted the tractor beam or the weapon system, shields, system by system. And I think there's actually potentially a legal problem with the tactical officer here immediately suggesting, before even hostilities have broken out, let me target their warp core.
He's a bit of a hothead. Shax, I believe is his name. He's always like, okay, let's go straight to the muscle, sort of like Worf in seasons 1 and 2 of Next Generation. So Captain Freeman says, oh, we're not going to fight you. And the Drukmani captain's response is, avoiding damage is fighting. I don't know. That's an interesting distinction. What do you guys think of that one?
Well, so that one is definitely, so we can talk about, military or law of war, which I think definitely also fails that analysis. But when it comes to the analogy of self-defense, there's a duty to retreat. So even if in some universe, the Starfleet was wrong to be in this situation, as can be interpreted as breaking a law or being aggressive. There's this constant dance when it comes to who is entitled in a fight to the legal privilege of using force, of self-defense. And if you have attempted to withdraw, if you've attempted to de-escalate, and you have therefore fulfilled this kind of duty to withdraw or retreat, even if you were originally in the wrong, the person who thinks they have the right to defend themselves can't keep going after you. And so avoiding damage is literally the definition of retreating.
It is, right. So Starfleet's in the right, in terms of the law here, I think, because they're refusing to engage.
I do think there's a fine line, though, between refusing to engage until hazarding a vessel. Because if you know they're trying to kill you and you're taking no action to defend your vessel and the lives of your entire crew, I think there's an issue of dereliction of duty that can arise and an issue of hazarding a vessel, which can be a death penalty offense if you do get the vessel lost.
Yes, I think you may be right, except that just in this particular circumstance, right, the shields should have been holding just fine, but for reasons we will discuss, they were not.
So, we get to Fletcher. Well, maybe we'll jump around a little bit, but that's a good segue to Crewman Fletcher, Ensign Fletcher, who gets a resounding introduction. We see him. We see that he's part of the lower decks group. He's friendly. He's well respected. He immediately disarms a conflict with the Doctor. He acts as a mediator, and you're thinking, "Wow, this guy. He's a peacemaker. He really knows what's going on. He's just very very skilled and a valued member." However, things kind of go south pretty quickly, and we start to learn some surprising things about him. When we leave him initially, he says he will cover for Mariner and Boimler so that they can go to the choo-choo dance, which is this interesting. It seems like a shipwide prom or something almost. I'm not.
It's very odd.
Yeah, it was interesting.
We don't actually see it, but we see like the stage view looking at everyone having a good time.
Right.
It's amazing. That's what we're supposed to assume. It's amazing, and they don't want to miss it.
Right, we get to be sort of bystanders for this huge event. Um, and then Boimler and Mariner, upon returning, they find Fletcher sort of knocked out. He says that he was attacked while working on the core, and of course, oh, this is horrifying. And we later learn that's not the full story. And we start getting into some problems now because we learn that ultimately Fletcher is lying to Boimler and Mariner. That leads Boimler and Mariner into a conflict with another group, Delta Shift. And we don't necessarily have a legal issue here. It's more just a quick introduction to them, and maybe they will play a larger part in future stories. But we learned that there's a rivalry among different groups within Lower Decks. And then as we learn more, we realize that Fletcher actually used the ship's computer to try and make himself smarter. Now that just seems problematic on many levels. He sort of bypassed any sort of rules, regulations, just kind of decided to do it on himself, sort of performing a human experiment upon himself. There's a lot of issues here. Well, Josh, what are you thinking here?
How does this guy get through the academy? How was he admitted into the service? It's very, very odd.
I assume he made it through the academy the same way he got promoted in this episode.
There's the Peter principle at play of just promoting someone so they get out, and you don't have to deal with them anymore. So that could be what was happening here. That said, he's a pathological liar. Maybe there's a little bit of narcissistic personality disorder at play because he wants to be the hero of the story. His interpersonal skills at the beginning do look great with de-escalation of a fight, but then it falls apart, and that's just weird.
So it's very interesting because any employment lawyer, I think, will look at this and think, all right, well, here you have the classic bad employee, and what is the employer to do? And we see stories all the time where employers don't know what to do. They try to transfer this bad employee out, move them around, put them in some place where they can do the least amount of harm. These are the sort of stories you hear. And it's interesting that we are seeing this kind of situation here in the 24th century. Like Josh said, how did this guy get through Starfleet? It's supposed to be the best and the brightest, but this guy made it through. And then he asks Mariner and Boimler to cover for him. And they do, at least at the beginning. They prioritize their loyalty to their friends above following the rules. Now, it's worthy to note that is not new to Star Trek. We've seen people flout the rules to be loyal to each other. Most notably in the original series, we see it during many of the episodes, a lot of loyalty to Kirk, to Spock. People flouting rules, and then especially in the movies, particularly in Star Trek 3, when Kirk and crew are told to stand down, they cannot take the Enterprise back to the planet Genesis, and so what do? They steal the Enterprise, and then they rescue Spock and essentially throw away their careers, and they're facing court-martial. It's nothing new there. This is why Kirk is often described as a cowboy. He just doesn't follow the conventional rules. And then we even see Picard doing some stuff like that. There's a lot of loyalty between him and his crew as well.
Can I just add as a quick contrast, when Spock broke the what they said was the only remaining Starfleet law that still had the death penalty, taking the ship back to
That's
Talos,
right.
in order to give Captain Pike the chance to kind of continue living through with the illusion of being healthy again. Unlike, I think, in some of these other instances, Spock was perfectly willing to face the consequences afterwards. Didn't think that because he felt this sense of loyalty that therefore literally excused the offense, right? He believed that he was going to be court-martialed and his career was over.
And that is an interesting point, Nari, because Spock, who is, we know he's half human, half Vulcan, and he struggles with that. And that's fodder for many good stories, although he seems to lean more to his Vulcan side. Certainly McCoy would have you believe that. And so you have a very coldly rational person who actually follows the dictates of loyalty rather than sort of the logical rules which would forbid him from going to Talos. So I mean it's a fascinating example. I want to point out, and this is so talk about a strange deep reference, but if you read Mad Magazine, and they do great parodies of Star Wars, Star Trek, etc., and they did a funny parody on Star Trek 4 at the point when the crew gets up for their court martial, and then the president says, "Mr. Spock, you were not accused," and Spock says, "Oh, Mr. President, I stand with my friends." And the president says, "Oh, okay, then you are accused of treason, of theft, destruction of Starfleet property. The penalty for which is death by hanging after being shot, after being electrocuted, and after being maimed." And Spock says, "Mr. President, I said I'd like to sit with my friends. They're right over there. Can I join them now, please?" And he sort of walked off. So, fair point though. Spock is a fascinating case. Back to Lower Decks though, is this Mariner and Boimler, are they right, morally, legally, to be covering for their friend here?
So I don't think covering for the friend necessarily, but on the point, I think sorry, Josh, do you have something on that before I move on to the next topic in this?
Go right ahead.
Which is just that when it comes to the question of, and, at some point when they do start to no longer be quite so willing to cover for him, and I don't really think they should have been from the get-go, but it's a little forgivable at the beginning when they don't think anything really serious has happened. At some point when they start to question whether they should be, I believe it was, sorry, what's his name again? Fletcher. Fletcher tries to sort of put the shoe on the other foot and say that Mariner breaks the rules all the time. Mariner, of course, responds that she only breaks dumb rules and doesn't put anyone in danger except sometimes Boimler. Now, there's a couple things there that I think actually aren't just like pithy responses, but actually have some substance to them. And the first is that there actually is an assumption, and this is not necessarily true in military regulations, but with other laws, there is actually kind of the assumption that people are not following the letter of the law down to a T and never cutting any corners, right? If we actually believed that if we passed a law that that everyone had to only cross at crosswalks, we would be in trouble. We expect people to sometimes cross not at a crosswalk when it's important enough, when there's zero traffic, things like that. I think that, what Mariner is hinting at is that there are certain rules that we kind of expect to be broken a certain amount when in the reality of a situation the purpose of the rule is not served or is not benefited by following it to a letter. And I think that's what Mariner's getting at. The other half of that is also, of course, that she doesn't put people in danger, parens except for Boimler. But joking aside, that does make a big difference, and it makes a big difference especially in terms of how we view civil liability. There's, a basic premise for suing anyone in civil court is that you have to have some kind of injury. And so, there's a moral question or an ethical question about, so-called victimless crimes. But when it comes to at least civil law and tort and suing someone for damages, there literally is no such thing as a victimless tort.
Ew.
Yeah. You have to prove some kind of injury. Now, granted, we have relatively broad definitions of injuries, especially in certain classes of tort. But in order to get into something where there's literally no injury, you're getting into strict liability crimes.
Right. Or, situations in which there's going to be punitive damages or something to send a message or to just punish the tortfeasor rather than to compensate the
yes, but there in some states have limits for how large punitive damages can be relative to compensatory damages, and there still must be something. There can't be $0 in compensatory damages or any damages, but then you got $1 million in punitive damages. There has to be something just to get you through that process.
But sometimes that can be very minor. In your 1983 cases or your Bivens cases, you do see juries award $1, and that's it. And then the plaintiff's lawyer can get all their attorney's fees. So the $1 can end up being thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. There are some interesting provisions like that. depending on what area in which we are dealing.
Section 19.3 is not tort. It is technically called constitutional tort, but it is a statutory. It is a cause of action created by statute as opposed to traditional tort.
And Bivens itself is a court-created remedy rather than a statute, but they're very similar because the analyses are essentially the same. The elements are very similar as well. So we're getting a little technical there, but coming back to, of course, right?
What we do.
To what some may appear to be esoteric discussions, but to us are fascinating play-by-plays. So point well taken there, that it may be okay for Mariner and Boimler to sort of bend the rules a little bit, because rules, the people who pass these rules understand that no one can follow all of them to the letter. And we've had that idea already explored in earlier episodes as well, when we learned about time that it takes everyone to finish their tasks, and inflating the time, and Boimler time, or whatever you want to call it. So we've run against that in the past too, where you have sort of the ideal of the rule, and then you have reality, which is, okay, we can't meet every requirement, so we do our best. It's sort of substantial compliance type of standard. So I think that if we analyze this sort of on the scale, in the beginning, when we don't know that Fletcher's lying very much, and he says someone knocked him out, and then Boimler and Mariner, they go and accuse Delta Shift. Okay, I mean, we haven't gone too far yet, but then they start to learn about how Fletcher tried to make himself smarter, created something that can now be dangerous to others. Now, even Mariner is starting to have second thoughts, saying, like Nari said, this could hurt other people. And now we're starting to, get into some trouble. This is a different picture entirely. If we talk about old philosophy, we're getting into sort of the idea of, sort of John Stuart Mill, like on liberty, you can do whatever you want so long as you don't hurt anyone else. Well, guess what, Fletcher, you're crossing that line now. You may be hurting someone else. So now you may be ethically on shakier ground. So at that point, there could be a good case made that maybe they should sort of throw him under the bus, but they stick with him. And the problem, as Josh mentioned earlier, when Fletcher messed up the rewiring of the core, the shields won't modulate correctly. Normally it wouldn't be a problem, but they're actually in an active confrontation right now with the Drukmani. So is this an example where one bad apple can really just, destroy the entire apple cart? What should we do here? How should Starfleet deal with this?
I did say that I think it's a little different with my analogizing about not following rules when the purpose of the rule isn't served, compared to like discipline on a military vessel. And there's a reason why you follow these procedures. This is a really good example of failure to follow a seemingly minor procedure having potentially catastrophic results. Josh, do you want to add anything specific, or can I kind of steamroll on here?
You go, girl.
So I was going to say, there's like a whole bunch that you could say that Fletcher might be doing here. One is, the first thing that came to mind for me is that this is basically an act of sabotage. For under the UCMJ, I think this would fit under, so besides like dereliction of duty or any of the kind of catch-all provisions, I think this would fit pretty well in Article 108, which is destruction of government property. Because not only does he, at first just mess up the wiring, when he attaches it to himself, he basically like destroys it, damages, loses it. It's no longer usable as a shield battery or whatever that thing was. Computer core.
Right. Is there also, Nari, is there a matter of degree here too? Because we have his intent. If we look at that, there seems to be a difference between intending the action versus intending the result. He wanted to take a shortcut to fix a ship. He didn't intend for the ship to be put at risk, to the Drukmani. So, playing his defense advocate for a second, give the guy a break, right?
Well, so Article 108, it says willfully or through neglect. So even if he originally intended to just temporarily misplace the core, or temporarily plug it into himself, but then the intent is to put it back in good working order once he's smart enough to know how to rewire it. I think by most normal human standards, this would not satisfy a duty of reasonable care. Plugging a computer cord directly into your brain
seems a little risky, and probably not what a reasonable person or a reasonable Starfleet officer would do, I would think. And so, did you have more to say on that, Nari?
No, that was all I had to. I'm not our usual expert, but I just wanted to chime in with our 108.
So when we go forward with this and kind of running with this employment setting issue, we get Fletcher, who by all rights should be in all sorts of trouble. However, his creation ends up saving the day against the Drukmani, and we see that the situation is very dire for the Cerritos. Their weapon systems are down. They are contemplating abandoning a ship, which is huge. I mean, the Cerritos is, maybe not the most advanced vessel in the fleet, but it's still a Starfleet vessel. So they went from this little salvage dispute to suddenly maybe having to abandon ship. And then Fletcher's creation saves their bacon. So Fletcher, who we now have realized is probably the most incompetent among the lower decks crew, and maybe even worse than that, he lies and he throws other people under the bus. He fails, and yet classically with some people, he fails upwards. He becomes a lieutenant, gets promoted, gets transferred to the USS Titan, which many Trek fans know is the ship that Will Riker left to command after Star Trek Nemesis. And there are several novels about that, about Riker and his adventures on the Titan. So this is everything's kind of worked out pretty well for Fletcher, right? I mean, he can just keep on making his mistakes, and he's failing upwards. All's well that ends well here, guys.
That can only go on for so long until competency catches up with you, and that caught up with him. There's the old maxim that character is destiny. Well, he had some problems.
Yeah, and I just want to add from sort of just from the legal perspective also, while generally, except for constitutional torts, as you pointed out, Steve, you have to show an injury to prove a tort. So if someone were trying to bring a tort action against him on account of the device that ends up saving the ship, you might be in trouble. But there are definitely other offenses, including the one that I just listed from the Uniform Code of Military Justice and other criminal offenses that don't necessarily require that there be an actual injury. You can just have criminal conduct just by doing an act. And in this case, I think this really would fit the bill, whether or not it worked out in the end. There's, I think, a reasonable causes of action here for at least Starfleet to bring him up on breaches of the military code.
And if we take a step back from all this, just trying to look at this, from the big picture, what we have is a situation where you have a giant organization like Starfleet that is engaged in very important and very hazardous work all the time, and you have this one member of the team who is not getting the job done, is dropping the ball, and even worse than that, is putting others in harm's way. What if that person ends up being on a key ship like the Titan, and the Titan is in some risky situation, and this person gets put in a place where they can make a real difference for good or for bad? And we know now that he would end up doing something that would be very costly. My goodness, he could spark the next interstellar war, right?
I was just going to say, what if the Fletcher bot, whatever that creature is, instead of landing on a ship that was actively attacking a Starfleet vessel, landed on, let's say, like a Cardassian ship during the middle of a peace negotiation?
Right. And then another Cardassian war, all because Mariner and Boimler would not rat him out, right? So it's on them. At least so goes one of the arguments. So we've talked quite a bit about Fletcher there. Now let's sort of shift gears a little bit to talk about Rutherford and Tendy's adventure on the holodeck.
My favorite character.
Where we meet Badgie, who just evokes a whole multitude of characters that I can think of. Do you guys remember the old Olympic mascot from the 96 Olympics in Atlanta?
Oh God.
What?
it was called What Is It, I think.
I was a little young, so I'm looking this up.
Josh is pulling something out here. Oh my God.
Oh yeah.
The Bill mascot. Fantastic.
From Schoolhouse Rock. So yeah,
Awesome.
it's a little
Awesome.
like that.
And Microsoft Word had the assistant, that paperclip that would talk to people too.
Oh yeah.
And these days we have, although not in physical form, we have Siri, Alexa. So Badgie is our holodeck guide. And unfortunately, things kind of go south, and he becomes this homicidal, sort of murderous, angry character. And I'll point out, too, we discussed this a little bit on our earlier episodes, sort of is this a PG type of show? Is it rated G? We get a couple curse words in every episode. And Badgie, at one point, is running around with the safety protocols taken off. And granted, these are holographic beings, but he's literally tearing them limb from limb. I'll point out that my little ones saw this, and they were saying, "Whoa, Dad, this is intense." Not what they expected from Star Trek. They were saying, this feels more like Star Wars or something darker. A little surprising, right?
It's not often in Star Trek that you see characters get their heads ripped off. I don't remember any instance of that.
I just want to say this is one of the things that I love about the show, though. I don't know if it would be completely kid appropriate because of the curse words every episode, and in this case because there is an ultraviolet holodeck logo. But it's one of the things that I love is that if you really did have this situation where the holodeck goes bonkers and the safety protocols are off, why wouldn't you have had a few more dismemberments?
True, right.
Well, granted, this is also a practical use of the holodeck, because we do have them make fun of the holodecks, just not for Sherlock Holmes and hanging out with Robin Hood. And it's just like, yeah, we've
talked about the uses of the holodeck for acting out like violent impulses in the episode where Tuvok mind melds with the murderer. And anyway.
And Worf's calisthenic programs are pretty darn intense. He's fighting some pretty scary creatures there.
And yeah, I think he's probably dismembering some of them in the scenes we don't see on screen.
Right.
But there's a reason why we don't see them on screen, because it's Worf's workout program would probably give most people nightmares.
Yeah.
But it gave Jadzia warm, fuzzy feelings.
It did. That's how we knew she was the right one for him, right?
Yes, I would call that a red flag.
But hey, Klingon mating rituals are, they're a little beyond me, I think. But
there's so many for everyone.
I'm just putting it out there.
She's awesome. She's absolutely awesome. Although Mariner is pretty awesome in her own right. So we get for Badgie now, we get to this story that we've seen before, where the creator Rutherford is going to have to put down his creation. Josh, I'm sure you can appreciate sort of the Universal Monsters reference here, right?
Oh, it's beautiful. It's Grant Badgie saying, "I will wear your skin." He said that a couple times. So that's again, battle stations. That's a very specific threat. And you generally take notice of somebody saying, "I will wear your skin." Because it's
especially in proximity to you, right? Like, we're not talking Badgie is trolling his creator over the internet.
No, and there's the Universal Monsters theme is huge. You try to make something, you treat it badly, and then it learns from that and decides to kill you. So there's a wonderful AI type reference with this as well, because that's what Badgie is. Because he's not running around outside of the holodeck, but he can create an abnormally dangerous situation on the holodeck with his full-on homicidal mode. Even though I do think that was super cute to them, just especially the end. And it does fall into the category of I was trying to impress the green.
Yeah.
And guys have been doing stupid things to impress women for millennia. So this is nothing new. People can relate that I was trying to impress a woman and it went bad. And
I think trying to impress either, if we're talking, if this is original series, Orion Slave Girl, or if this modern times, which is just Orion Woman, I can understand.
I mean, she is cute. I mean, it's like, yeah, I get that. But you have strict liability type issues when a creation that you make goes on a homicidal warpath.
So I was going to ask, does this raise a design defect issue?
I think Rutherford clearly messed up somewhere along the line, and he needs to own that. If Badgie somehow gets out into the real world, a la Moriarty, and starts inflicting some real damage, Rutherford's going to be in some trouble here. Like Fletcher. Except that Fletcher fails upwards, and I'm not sure that Rutherford would, or at least we haven't established that yet. And he's trying to impress Tendi, but no one's going to be very impressed if Badgie ends up killing them both, right?
I think or at least they won't be impressed for long.
Yeah, right. It would be wow, okay, that's a short date there. We get a lot of sci-fi callbacks here, and I'm going to point out a few, but you guys please chime in. One of the first ones that jumped out at me was certainly Ultron and Hank Pym. I mean, because that's literally father, son, and Ultron decides that, well, in order to make the world as safe as possible, let's eliminate humanity, and that had some logical appeal in his brain. What else have we got here? Skynet, term. You create something and it rises and kills you. You've got the Matrix, right? You create AI and you have a war, and that was the backstory for that was filled in more through the Animatrix. Battlestar Galactica, the reimagined version, at least, where the humans, the colonies, 12 colonies, created the Cylons, who then rose up and kind of took them over and tried to annihilate them. But we've got this in so many different stories, and then again, we talked about the universal monsters. Frankenstein jumped out at me, but I'm sure there are others as well. Your creation, who you treat poorly, ends up trying to kill you. And that leads to this exchange. I don't know if I would call it moving or not, maybe. Badgie calls Rutherford father and says, "You can't hurt me, father, maybe with your disappointment, but not with your fists." And then ultimately Rutherford holds Badgie and snaps his neck and then kills him. And sort of cries in the process. So this is just so painful, right? And yet Badgie comes back and says, "Well, I'm always here." So I don't know. Do we need to take this program offline, you guys? What do you think?
Does Starfleet not have a standing protocol on this after Moriarty? Are you serious?
Apparently not. I don't know.
I think Badgie needs some work. Granted, I was cackling with joy watching this, especially with the neck snap and the crying no, just because it was just so perfect and just brilliant, like out in the snow. So it's like, is this supposed to be like The Shining, or is it like it, like, or excuse me, The Thing? Like which old horror stories are we dealing with here? And that was just, it brought me joy. And the fact that his attempt to impress his colleague results in a trip to sickbay after getting stabbed. That's always explain that. Well, I was on the holiday.
It's a long story. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to note also that this question, which I have only jokingly alluded to, about liability for AIs that decide to kill people, is actually of increasing salience given that we are trying to prepare for the arrival of autonomous vehicles.
And we've had some issues with that already. But anyone who has litigated automobile cases can see that there are just a plethora of issues out there through autonomous vehicles, and how are torts going to be handled then, for better or for worse?
as to step briefly in the role of Rutherford's defense instead of the person trying to sue him, I will say that I believe, Steve, this might fall into the same problem as our aircraft carrier, that it was not commercially available. It was not for sale. It's not anywhere. Badgie is nowhere on the market. So the fact that he was showing this private creation to his friend, there might still be liability here, but it's not going to be through design defect.
And, you know, it's interesting. It also just depends on what happens. Like, let's say Badgie escapes and then kills some other crew members. Well, would Rutherford be sued or liable to, you know?
Well, so there would, I mean, wouldn't you get normal negligence in that case?
Well,
like
there would be
issues.
You know, you could have a Ferries bar, you know, under the Ferries doctrine, depending on who was hurt. However, if we change the facts a little bit, and let's say Badgie escapes and kills, say, an alien ambassador or guests on the ship that are not part of Starfleet, and now we've got some problems, you know. Or if Badgie kills some civilians, you know, then what? Josh?
Or what if Badgie works correctly and somebody still dies as a training accident? Then it's a training accident, and that's in a completely different category.
Yeah, but and this is why we could always easily have entire shows on Law of Holodecks, because at that point we're not talking about a defect with Badgie. At that point we're talking about some kind of thing going wrong, be it user error, manufacturer error, or design error with these gosh darn holodeck safety protocols.
The holodeck is a device that is so great and so wonderful, you know, to use, and yet so rife with problems. So that closes out most of this episode. Closing thoughts, Nari, Josh?
It brings me joy.
Just that I continue to be absolutely impressed with this show. I will be very sad when it goes off for a while in anticipation of season 2. Of course, I have other things to keep me busy in the meantime, but gosh, I love this show.
It is a lot of fun, absolutely, and we've got more Trek on the way too. So this reminds me of sort of the 90s, I guess, which, looking back, I suppose was the golden age of Trek, where you had so many shows on and movies and everything. We're Trek fans are sort of spoiled right now for a lot of content. Any other thoughts?
I, too, fondly remember the 90s, which was not my early childhood. I do remember my dad watching Next Generations on TV and being very, very afraid of the Borg as a small child.
I could totally see that. Yeah.
And at some point, I would love to talk about how the Borg are communism.
Well, yeah.
Oh, no. Well, I could also give you a whole episode discussing like the Borg and what they might be a metaphor for. I do think they're a pretty obvious metaphor for some form of collectivism, right? And like I could talk your ear off about how I think like the central thesis of Star Trek is some form of individualism versus collectivism.
Yes.
Not necessarily speaking about the extremes, because obviously they live together in a federation, in a society, on a ship, all these things. But there are so many episodes that are about this fundamental tension between the collective will of a society, typically a society which a Star Trek ship is visiting, and an individual in that society, and it forces them to contend with the prime directive. Can they intervene to assist this individual from being oppressed or suppressed? And anyway.
Yes, no, that is outstanding material. We could talk. There's so many episodes that deal with that, and it's always a fascinating, discussion. Another time, perhaps.
Yes.
Oh, I just want to plug one thing, which is apparently, I did not read it, my boyfriend did, but Peter Thiel in his book apparently said that he and his friends loved the capitalist Star Wars rather than the socialist Star Trek. And this is why I happen to have thought a lot about this.
Wow.
Is because I think that can only be based on a shallow understanding of Star Trek, where yes, they don't seem to really have much in the way of like money or market economy, but we can get into that another time.
Another time. So with that, everyone, thank you for tuning in. Nari and Steve, thank you for joining us. And yes, I did wear my Mirror Universe shirt with Long Live the Empire from Discovery Season 2, because that was the best part of Discovery Season 1, or Season 1, Part 2. Anyway, thank you all. and live long and prosper. Take care.